Broadly speaking, on the topic of glacial lake outburst floods, and the subheading, the subtitle, I suppose, is anatomy, impact, and disaster risk reduction. I'm going to add in modelling to that because that's something I've done a bit of. And you're going to ask me to talk a little bit about the modelling work and go into some of the technical detail about that. So that's something I'll touch on as well. So let's kick off. Broadly speaking, I'm going to go through the following things. So we'll look at the anatomy of GLOFs, glacial lake outburst floods, and really why should we care about them. We will consider how does a GLOF hazard actually develop into an outburst flood. I'll spend a bit of time talking about modelling, how do we simulate GLOFs, and what are some of the key considerations of doing so. Then briefly touch on the impacts, both in terms of impacts to the physical environment and landscapes, and also to communities and society, infrastructure, renewable energy, with hydropower being perhaps the obvious one in the Himalaya. And to end on, I'll talk again about disaster risk reduction. How can we reduce GLOF hazard and exposure, or quantify it, or perhaps engage with communities or put methods in place that help us to reduce that risk. So up front, let's consider what a glacial lake outburst flood actually is. Well, I've got a few bullet points here, so I'll go through them in order to build a picture of what we're kind of dealing with when we talk about glacial lake outburst floods. So high magnitude, low frequency, rapid onset floods, which basically means that they don't happen very often, i.e. they're low frequency. But when they do, they're high magnitude with peak discharges, which commonly exceed seasonal high flows by orders, or an order of magnitude, or even orders of magnitude. They're rapid onset because there's generally a fairly short time between the beginning of the flood and the peak, and I'll develop that a little bit more as I go on. They originate from a water body underneath, within, or at the margins of a glacier. And in the following slides, I'll kind of break down the different settings and landscapes in which we might find these water bodies that could produce an outburst flood. They commonly exhibit what's known as complex flow rheology, which in simple terms means that they can transition between a kind of a standard clear water flow to a debris flood, or what's also called a hyperconcentrated flow. It's very much sediment laden, to a debris flow where we have non-Newtonian flow hydraulics and lots of complicated things going on, where debris and fluids behave in a different manner as they do to clear water floods. They have enormous potential for undertaking and affecting geomorphological reworking of channel and valley floor environments. So we're talking about substantial capacity to erode and to leave extensive deposits on the valley floor, which bring problems. They can pose a significant hazard to life, settlements, and infrastructure. And they can also have transboundary impact. So because they're able to travel for tens, if not hundreds of kilometers in some instances, they have local, regional, and also sometimes national impact, where they cross borders from one river basin, from one national or state to another. So I thought I'd very briefly talk about how we define what a glacial lake outburst flood actually is. And some of you may have come across this term yoklab, which is an Icelandic word, and the original definition of this word means the sudden generation and release of water due to geothermal activity or a subglacial volcanic eruption. At least that was the kind of type of flood that this word was applied to originally. It's used sometimes interchangeably with glacial lake outburst flood, and obviously it's not so relevant in the Himalaya. We don't have volcanic glaciers which are sitting on top of volcanoes, as you can see in the figure, the schematic in the top right there. And in this example, we have warming from beneath a glacier, which melts the ice above it and produces the water, which then escapes through a glacial system to form an outburst flood. We also have englacial or subglacial floods, which involve the temporary storage and sudden release of meltwater water, either from within or below a glacier. So a nice recent example from the Himalaya was published by Dave Rouse et al. In the cryosphere a couple of years ago, where they documented what they believed to have been an englacial flood, or rather the build-up and release of a water body which developed within Lhotse Glacier in the Khumbu Mal. So do check that study out. That's really quite interesting. And if we think about different settings, different ways, different scenarios in which lakes can actually develop, or water can develop and temporarily become dammed before being released. And this is a nice figure that I've used a few times in talks, and it's useful because it shows different kind of the complexity involved in not just a high mountain system, but many others as well, including lowland glaciers and ice cap settings. And so here we have two glaciers. In the left-hand top left, flowing down to the center, we have a glacier with a retreating tributary glacier just to the north of it, and water is developed in between these two ice bodies. Further down and to the left slightly, where it says ice confluence, we have the ponding of water there, where there's the other tributary glacier joins the main glacier. And we also have various other numerous marginal or ice marginal lakes. Now, what can happen is, in this example, let's take the superglacial, or sorry, the ice marginal lake at the top here. I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, hopefully you can. What might happen is that that lake water, that lake might fill up to the point where it actually manages to float the ice temporarily, which dams it here, and the water can escape through the glacier system, generally through an existing subglacial passage, or one that expands as the water progresses through the system. Flood waters travel subglacially, and the flood exits the glacier system further down valley. In recent years, there's been nice examples of these from Alaska in Suicide Basin. That's a good prominent example of this type of lake which is formed. We do get these types of things happening in the Himalaya, so it's not all about moraine dam lakes, which I'm going to dwell probably a bit more on later on in the talk. But this is just kind of a teaser as to how we get water ponding at the margins of ice bodies that can generate a hazard. Another nice example is this one, which I borrowed from Clegg and Evans from a paper that's 20 years old now or so. And this is perhaps what some of you may be more familiar with in the Himalaya. And so here we have a similar kind of top-down view of a valley, or a series of valleys, where we have at least three ice bodies. So here we have a glacier, excuse me. The left-hand side, we have one flowing from north to south on the top here, and another one flowing from south to north in the bottom right. And we've got at least three different styles, moraine dam lake development here. So let's go with them in order. Here we have a tributary glacier which has reached its maximum extent. It's deposited the moraine, which has blocked the valley here, and it's retreated, leaving moraine dam lake in the space between where the current glacier margin is and where the lateral moraine is. In scenario 2, it's slightly different in that we have the main trunk glacier, which is flowing down this valley. So this trunk glacier again has built a terminal lateral moraine at the front, which is breached, and so the flow from this glacier isn't ponding, but what it has done is dammed tributary valley here. So we've got a similar situation to Lake 1, but the mode of damming is slightly different, in which it's this trunk glacier which has built the moraine which has blocked this valley. Moraine dam lake number 3, again slightly different in that it occurs in the trunk valley itself, and so this tributary glacier in the bottom right has advanced at some point. It's built this large lateral terminal moraine complex at the end, and again, like the glacier to the left, it's freely draining, but it's blocked the valley, and so we've had a moraine dam lake which is developed here. So this isn't uncommon. We do get, not just in the Himalaya, but further afield, catchments where we have multiple moraine dam lakes that are developed in different ways, and which can also occur in a kind of a cascade as well, which has its own implications for hazard development and makes things a bit more complex. In the previous slide, we saw examples mostly of where glaciers had retreated and lakes had formed in the space left between the moraines and the current day terminus. But what we also find, especially in the Himalaya, where we have lots of debris supply, which lead to the development of debris-covered glaciers, is that we get lakes developing on the surface of glaciers as well. So this is an example from Nepal. This is Unguzumpa Glacier. It's the biggest, if not one of the biggest glaciers in Nepal, and it's heavily debris covered along its length. And this kind of glacier, which has a low slope profile, lots of complex hummocky topography on its surface, gives rise to the development of ponds, superglacial ponds, which coalesce and expand and form glacial lakes. This is Imja show, which some of you may be familiar with in the Himalaya, and this is an image from some declassified American spy satellite imagery, corona imagery from the late 60s. And on it, you can see this is Imja Glacier, as it was 50 years ago or so, I guess. And what we can see on the surface at this point is that we don't have the large lake that this glacier is known for now, but what we do have are a series of these ponds, I suppose you could call them. They're quite large already by that point, but they're not really connected to one another. In the field, these ponds look something like this. This again is an image from Unguzumpa Glacier, but it shows you in the field what these ponds kind of look like and how they start out life. As they develop, they merge and they can form these what are known as proto-glacial lakes, I suppose, which can be quite big in themselves. And ultimately what happens is that over the course of decades, generally you get from a situation where you have a few ponds to an enormous lake, which can measure, in this case, up to 2 kilometers long or more. This imagery is 13, 14 years old now, and the lake is substantially bigger at this point. But we're talking about the storage and the impoundment of millions and millions, if not hundreds of millions, of cubic meters of water. So that's a bit of background, I suppose, about how lakes generally develop. But regardless of how a lake or a large meltwater store develops, in order to produce a glacial-like outburst flood, what we need a few ingredients. One of those ingredients is obviously a water body, and the red there is the trigger. So we also need a trigger. Now, in between, we might also have some conditioning factors from the catchment of the lake itself, which increases the hazard and increases the likelihood of a glacial lake outburst flood occurring. So, what might trigger a glacial lake outburst flood? This is a sketch I put together for a paper we put out a few years ago, a review paper in their science reviews, and it's adapted from an earlier figure by John Reynolds and Sean Richardson in their 2000 paper. But it shows a kind of a cartoon figure, it's fairly idealized. It shows a cartoon figure of a catchment, a mountain catchment, where we have a glacial lake that's developed and sits currently, it's impounded in this basin in front of a receding mountain glacier. So what's going on here? Well, we have the lake, but what we also need are some triggers. So what we've identified in this figure are at least 3, and there are more potential triggers in these kind of catchments. So from left to right, if we look at the red circles, what we have are glacier calving. So we might have a large chunk of ice carves off the front of a glacier and forms a displacement wave. We know that these waves happen, they're common. Calving is a natural glaciological process, so there's nothing unusual about that. And in actual fact, to the best of my knowledge, there haven't been too many documented examples where this has actually triggered a glacial lake outburst flood. The majority of historical cases of gloughs where we know what the trigger has been, and there is a lot of uncertainty here because it's largely a reconstructive exercise, is from the collapse of hanging glaciers or rock or ice avalanches which enter the lake from the slopes above the lake. So here, if we look at the second red circle in, and we have a glacier which is perched perhaps slightly up on the mountainside and may destabilize and release a mass which gains enough momentum and impact energy to form a wave in the lake, which ultimately overtops it. We could also have debris flows and so on. On the right-hand side, there's a few others that I haven't touched on yet that are important. So rainfall, either sudden cloudburst events, perhaps combined with high precipitation, such as you find in the monsoon period, can also trigger overtopping and outburst events. And I'll touch on a recent example from India on the next couple of slides where that's occurred. What we also have is ice melt and piping. And whilst piping is a trigger and can be, and again, I've got another case study to show you where that is deemed to have been the cause of a GLOF. And we also have ice melt, which is kind of sits on the fence, I suppose, between being a trigger and a conditioning factor. Earthquakes are mentioned there, but I'm a little fuzzy on whether GLOFs occur following major earthquakes. To the best of my knowledge, that's not primary trigger, or at least a dominant trigger of GLOFs in the historical record. Ultimately, what we tend to find happens is either a mass enters the lake and causes a displacement wave, or perhaps a seiche wave, which is slightly different, and a wave propagates along the lake surface, overtops the moraine dam, which is generally composed of unconsolidated, fairly easily erodible sediment, and either enlarges an existing outlet channel or carves its own outlet channel, a new one, through the terminal moraine, which forms the outlet for some escaping flood waters. Or we have what's known as piping or seepage, where we have water flowing through the moraine dam and it escapes via some kind of outlet or portal through the moraine dam, which then enlarges and may lead to breach development. The final thing, I suppose, ultimately what we have is the release of a large quantity of water, generally quickly, sudden onset floods with a very high peak discharge. So although understanding what the triggers are is very, very important, the end product is a high magnitude flood, which can cause devastation downstream. There's a distinction to be made between push waves or displacement waves. So when a large mass enters a water body, either it displaces the surface of the water, and what we get is a push wave or a displacement wave, or if the mass is large enough and enters the lake fast enough, it can actually mobilize the entire water volume in that lake. It's kind of like sitting in a bathtub too quickly, where everything sloshes up and back again, and you get that sloshing effect occurring in glacial lakes. So the diagram here kind of tries to show that, where we have this oscillation around a central pivot point of that water body. And in terms of GLOF hazard, the seiche waves, so this full-scale mobilization of lake water, is really quite significant and can be more devastating than a single or a couple of displacement waves, because once a seiche wave is initiated, then you've got to wait until that oscillation dies down. Now, every time the water runs up against the moraine dam, on the right-hand side there, that in itself may release enough water to be called a GLOF in its own right, but it also results in a kind of a pulsing or a surging behavior, which can be very effective, eroding moraine dams and enlarging them so that the water, or large portion of that water volume, is ultimately released, perhaps more than may have been so with a general displacement wave. These are what moraine dams tend to look like. This is one of my photographs from Nepal. This is the Dig Show moraine dam, which failed in 1985 as a result of an ice avalanche into the lake. And these structures can be vast. Terminal moraines, glacial moraines can often be very, very large structures. And to give you an example, give you some context of how large this breach is, which you can see towards the bottom right of the moraine, you can actually fit the entire Statue of Liberty in this breach. That gives you some context. These are huge, and you really feel really quite small, and it's staggering the amount of force and energy that would have been expended to actually erode a breach of that size through a moraine dam. To give you another sense of scale, to the bottom left there, you can see a large boulder, which was originally perched on the moraine. You can see from historical photographs that it was perched on the moraine, so it hasn't been shifted as such by the discharge from the lake, but it's still at the upper end of mobilization, I suppose, in terms of boulder size. That very same boulder, a bit closer up, and you can see it's not far off the size of a house, basically. So very large landscapes, and so we need a huge amounts of energy required to perform this geomorphological work, produce these breaches, and yeah, so it's serious amounts of energy involved. I said I'd talk a little bit about rainfall triggered GLOFs, and a good example is the 2013 Kedarnath GLOF, and this occurred in June in 2013, and it followed a period of early onset monsoon rainfall, I believe. So we had unusual hydrometeorological conditions, heavy monsoon rainfall, and a lot of snowmelt in the weeks preceding this GLOF event in the catchment where it occurred. And this caused a seasonal lake, Chorobari Lake, to fill and overtop. And what we had here also is that we found that the topographic disposition of the lake and watershed was conducive to the rapid surface runoff and filling up of this lake. We also lacked a stable or an armoured moraine dam outlet, so there wasn't really an outlet that existed there which could actually kind of divert and accommodate some of that flow. And so a large breach developed very quickly, and these things played an important role in the hazard development, which found that over half of the village structures were destroyed just downstream, and there's been a series of papers which I've noted here, which people can follow up on if they wish. Here's a nice picture. Well, obviously not so nice for the people living there. It's a tragic event, but it shows you the extent of the devastation that occurred. Anything that's in red for buildings that were completely destroyed. Anything yellow was damaged or partly destroyed, and green slightly or altogether unaffected. Something that also caught my eye recently was that there have been a couple of papers that have come out where piping or seepage through moraine dams has been documented, and this is generally quite rare. We find that, like I said earlier, most of the moraine dam failures which have occurred, which have caused GLOFs, have been triggered by ice avalanches into lakes, and we get a breach forming a subaerial breach on top of the moraine dam, which enlarges and is the route for the lake water to expand. But actually what's interesting, or more interesting actually, I think, is how lake water can actually escape through a moraine. And so this is an example from an Indian glacier. This is the Gir Glacier, and it was published by Schmidt et al. And Majid et al. In the last couple of years, and a nice couple of papers that have come out which have tried to reconstruct this event. And what they found is that in this case, as I've shown in the figure on the right-hand side, there isn't a classic overtopping breach, and what instead you have is evidence of the primary outlet for the lake water being through the moraine dam, potentially via degradation of ice and ice core within that moraine dam. The final, I suppose, outcome is the development of a GLOF, a glacial outburst flood, but the mechanism by which that GLOF develops is really quite different to a classic breach. And some older work by one of my colleagues, John Reynolds, found that actually ice can be really quite widespread in moraine dams. This is some work from some time ago now, where they use electrical resistivity profiles across a terminal moraine complex in Indra Glacier in Nepal, and it shows you that the purple colours and the blues are indicative of ice bodies in the moraine dam. So this brings, and this is complicated really for GLOF hazard development, because unless you do detailed field surveys, it's tricky to know whether there is ice. There's clues. You can have hummocky surface topography, and we know that many moraine dams do have that, and give some indication that there are melting ice blocks within the moraine dam itself. So we can do these field surveys. We can also use high resolution topographic surveying or repeat digital elevation models, DEM differencing, to see whether a moraine dam is lowering over time. In this case, what happened is that we had overtopping by a push or a sage wave. That was one mechanism by which a breach can develop. But actually what happened in this case is that we had a moraine core, an ice core, and so rather than overtopping and the development of a classic breach, we had moraine ice degradation perhaps, and so the development of a route for that water to escape through the moraine dam. Now, what can happen in some of the modelling work I did some time ago for my PhD, we found that when we simulated these piping style failures, where water flows through the moraine dam and out again in the process, what it does is washes out all of the fine material in that passageway, which decreases the stability of the overlying mass. And we found that failures which originated or started off life as piping failures like this actually developed in most cases into full-blown subaerial failures. And so we had eventually collapse of the overlying moraine and the development of a subaerial or open air breach as well. And so the transition from low flow to high flow is actually really quite rapid and triggered by retrogressive erosion or back wasting of the ice distal face of a moraine dam. Is it an alternative and potentially overlooked mechanism for breach initiation? Well, perhaps. It's an open question, I suppose, and it's something that's certainly piqued my curiosity. What is the impact of climate change on how breaches might develop through moraine dams? Perhaps this is something that we should be keeping an eye on if we can, and dedicating some energy into doing so. So I've talked a little bit there about what is a GLOF, how it develops, how lakes form, and what some of the likely trigger mechanisms can be for glacial-like outburst floods. I guess with an emphasis on moraine dam lakes more than anything, perhaps because that's the style of lake I'm the most interested in. How do we model them then? Okay, so we have some understanding of how they develop, but how do we simulate glacial-like outburst floods? Well, at the simplest level, what we tend to want to do is to generate a lake outflow hydrograph. And I've shown an example, one above here. It's not a real hydrograph, it's one that we put together for a paper. And what we want to do is simulate this because it forms, for the most part, an upstream boundary condition for a flow model, which is used to send the flood down the valley and look at the geomorphological impacts, look at the hazard posed to people, to structures, and so on. And so these breach hydrographs look something like this at the top here, and they have generally a number of phases. I suppose if you look on the x-axis, we have T0 all the way through to T5. And so between T0 and T1, we have a stable dam. It's not going to fail anytime soon, and it's kind of happy just sitting there. We then have some kind of trigger event at T1, which results in breach initiation. And the length of breach initiation, there's no fixed rule as to how long that might be. It could be hours, it could be days, it could take quite some time. What's important to note is that the breach initiation phase, there's still no guarantee that full-blown breach formation through a moraine dam could actually develop. If the breach enlarges to the point where it becomes runaway expansion of the breach, then it transitions to what's known as breach formation. Sometimes breaches can actually kind of stop developing. The channel through the breach or over the moraine dam might become armoured with ice boulders and so on, and so a GLOF can actually be naturally avoided. However, if it does develop into a full-blown breach, then what we see is rapid increase in discharge and flow from the lake, ultimately peaking at some point. And again, that peak varies in time. The discharge itself is generally, as I said very much earlier in the presentation, many orders of magnitude higher, or at least an order of magnitude higher than the seasonal high flow floods, especially in fairly steep mountain rivers. How do we actually go about generating these? Well, if we think about the breach itself, what we want to know, let's say we want to figure out what the peak discharge is coming from a lake. Well, this is a screen grab of a table that we had in a review paper a few years ago. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's lots of different ways in which to figure out or estimate using empirical equations what the peak discharge from a given lake is. And this is great. They're very simple to use, and often what you actually only need are some geometric descriptors of the moraine dam, such as its height, or you might want to know the volume of the lake in the moraine itself, and moraine dam lake itself. And so there are equations we can use. Duncan Quincy and Simon Cook had a paper which followed up on some of Christian Huggle's work a few years ago, where they used the surface area of lakes and built a relationship between surface area and depth or volume of known lakes to figure out how you can arrive at an estimate of volume if you just know the surface area. So there are ways of getting at that value. But broadly speaking, most of these were developed for engineered structures, and so only a handful of these actually involve natural dams, and even then there's a range of those that are applicable to landslide dams, lakes, to moraine dam lakes, and whilst they're very simple, they're also prone to quite a lot of error, I suppose. To build on that, to go beyond empirical equations, what we could also use are what's known as analytical dam breach models. And these are a bit more sophisticated than empirical dam breach models. They're semi-physically based, and they incorporate some simplified numerical treatments of real processes, and they also assume often that the rate of breach growth is purely time dependent. Some of them require you to specify what the final breach dimensions are going to be. So that brings problems, because especially if we're wanting to use these models in a predictive capacity, then we don't know what the final breach dimensions could be, and so there's a lot of assumptions that have to go into these. Although things have come on in recent years, and of course, as I'll show a few slides time, we have far more advanced ways now of breaching moraines and modeling the breaching process. We find that these empirical equations and analytical equations are actually still fairly widely used in the literature. It's not uncommon to see these even now. I suppose there's a few reasons for that. When it comes to routing flow downstream, then again, we have a range of options available to us. At the very simplest level, we can use GIS-based flow routing algorithms, which simply require a starting point and some assumptions about the upstream hydrograph or input volume of water, and they route flow over the DEM using so-called D8 methods. So we're talking about multiple or single flow algorithms, which basically transfer flow from one cell on the DEM to the path of steepest descent, if you like. The more advanced models we have are available to us are one-dimensional numerical models, and a good example is the well-known HECRAS simulation tool, which now I'm aware, although I've not played around with it, can simulate 2D flow. And prior to 2016, it was largely a one-dimensional numerical solver, which means that it couldn't really account for lateral variations in flow, but it could account for variations in flow depth along the flow path. We also now have fully two-dimensional numerical models, which can simulate both changes in depth and also lateral spread and changes in depth across a channel, not just treating it as a singular kind of simple flow height that you vary down a river channel. Some nice prominent examples of these codes are the ArvaFlow work that Martin McGilley and colleagues have published, and there's a wide and expanding body of literature on that work, and also the RAMS model as well. What's really neat about these models is that they're able to accommodate multi-phase flow. So up front, if you recall, I mentioned that glacial lake outburst floods often aren't simple, clear water flows. They can be very complex. They can transition in both space and time from clear flows to very debris-laden complex flows. And so these state-of-the-art two-dimensional numerical models can simulate this as well, which is obviously great for the physicality side of things and doing the best job possible of representing what actually happens in reality. However, they do come with some caveats in that the more advanced model, the more parameters it requires to set up, the more information you need to provide and have access to at the outset, which can be difficult to obtain. They also tend to be computationally a little bit more demanding. And so if you're limited on the computing power, then two-dimensional numerical models may be something that's not actually feasible to use. That's becoming less of a barrier as we have access to more and more computing power. And so will probably become less of in the future. This is a nice example of some work that I did with some Chinese colleagues in the last couple of years, trying to reconstruct a glough from a Tibetan moraine dammed lake. And this case study was interesting for a couple of reasons. Here we employed a two-dimensional solver to look at the glacial lake outburst flood itself, rather than simulating the process chain in one go, which is what some of these most recent models can do. We developed a breach hydrograph separately and used that as the input to a two-dimensional flow routing algorithm. And you can see here, this is one of the figures from this paper, which is published in Geomorphology. And this particular figure shows how in space and time the flow depth evolves as we move downstream from the Moraine Dam Lake, which is located in the bottom right of each of one of those panels there. This was an interesting study to work on, because what we found was that actually this was a series of lakes. It was a cascade, and so we had the Moraine Dam Lake, where obviously the Gloff started from, but we had two further lakes downstream. The first one there, Chong Ba Mang Sho, is a natural lake which forms in a depression in the landscape. And the second, the much larger lake there to the left-hand side, is a reservoir, effectively. The river is dammed, and so this is a lake that's been developed artificially by humans. And what we found was that these lakes actually had a really significant buffering effect on volume of water, which ultimately ended up going further downstream and didn't cause any fatalities and only limited damage, I suppose. So that in itself was interesting. We estimated that something like 90% or just over 90% of the flood volume was contained in the area shown on this picture, high up in the catchment, and never really made it down further downstream, certainly not in a sudden onset flood. There was damage to a dam structure and so on. But this is a contrast to other case studies where we found that cascading lakes can actually pose a hazard in themselves. So to go to the other end of the extreme, if we have a Moraine Dam Lake, which is perhaps joined to another one, very close proximity to another, we can have a cascading effect where the failure of one lake then causes the failure downstream of another lake. And so you get an increase in the volume of water and the severity of the Gloff as it stands to cause damage further downstream. What was also interesting about this particular case study is that when we were trying to figure out what the likely trigger of the Gloff was, we settled on the most likely explanation being an ice avalanche from the retreating parent glacier, and the carving of some hanging ice, which would have entered the lake and caused an overtopping style failure and breach development. But then when my colleagues dived into some of the local weather station data, regional weather station data, we found that in the weeks prior to the outburst flood, there had been quite a lot of precipitation, something like 40% higher than the mean for that time of the year prior to the Gloff. And so there was a suggestion perhaps that had caused some instability of the parent glacier and promoted the development of a nice avalanche, or at least it could have been a conditioning factor, if not a trigger itself. What we also used for this work was some UAVs and some structure from motion topography to get a better or really good handle on what the geometry of the Moraine Dam was, which is important for parameterizing the breach model. And we're finding that these emergent landscape surveying methods, so drones, structure from motion, can actually be quite useful for glacial lake outburst flood related work. And they're very versatile, and the quality of the data that you can get using these methods from a topographic perspective is excellent. I suppose this should be set against the context of improvements in satellite remote sensing data and the quality and the resolution, both spatial and temporal, of those data sources. And so we're really quite fortunate, I suppose, in some regards, that we do have access now to these really good digital elevation models, which can be used both for improving understanding geomorphological analysis of lake systems, both failed moraine dams and ones which might fail or we think could pose a hazard in the future. And high resolution digital elevation models, which ultimately form a really important part of any flood routing model when we're looking at propagating or sending a flood further down the valley. But do we always need to use the most sophisticated numerical models? My feeling is no. I think the reason for undertaking glacial lake outburst flood modelling to really drive the choice. And so just because we do have access to these, all singing, all dancing, very sophisticated models doesn't always mean that we should use them. So I've picked out a couple of case studies from the last couple of years, as you can see there in the bottom left, where you guys from Potsdam, some of you have used empirical dam breach equations for doing these large-scale predictive ensemble models, which wouldn't really be feasible with a really complicated two-dimensional solver, especially not when you try and scale up to consider thousands and thousands of model runs. But then on the other hand, there is obviously clearly a place for these very sophisticated models, especially for site scale glacial lake outburst flood reconstructions of historical gloughs or for predictive modelling. One thing I found in some of the research I did not so long ago was that the digital elevation model grid resolution can actually be really quite important, especially close to the flood source. And what you find is that you get quite a difference in the inundated area from a glacial lake outburst flood if you vary the resolution of the digital elevation model that you actually use to route that flood water across. And what we find is that as you decrease the resolution or improve it, I suppose, if you go an example on the right hand side there from 32 meters down to 4 meters, you see that the spread of the water changes quite dramatically. There's less of a change when we dropped from 8 meters down to 4 meters, but especially when you looked at, doubling or even tripling that resolution, then it really was, it was quite striking. Admittedly, I'll hold my hands up and say this was only about a mile or so, kilometre and a half distance that we simulated this over. We didn't look at how it affected flow further downstream, and I think some people have in the literature. But when it comes to producing hazard maps and seeing where glacial lake outburst floodwaters might intersect settlements, infrastructure, roads, and so on, then this becomes quite important. What we're likely to see is that you get increasing convergence of flood extents or hydrographs with increasing distance from the flood source. We know that glacial lake outburst floods do a lot of geomorphological work fairly close to their source, and that their power tends to attenuate quite rapidly with increasing distance. And so, again, whilst this isn't something that I've tested, my hunch is that you're likely to see increasing convergence of flood extents and hydrographs, as you move downstream. And so this DEM grid resolution issue may become less important, arguably. Of course, when you use a higher resolution DEM, that also increases substantially the computing power that is required to run a flood model. And so there is a consideration there, various factors to consider, not just the reason for doing the modelling, but that is the primary driver in my view. So that's kind of the anatomy of gloughs. That's some of the modelling approaches that I've used and are available for people to use to simulate these things. But what about the impacts? What happens when a glacial lake outburst flood actually occurs? We're going to revisit briefly here on this slide the Dig Show glough from the Khumbu Valley in Nepal from 1985, and this is one of the photographs from I visited around 10 years ago, I think now, and this is quite good. It's a nice photo because it illustrates quite prominently what the impact of the glough can be on the landscape. This, in terms of distance, I guess we're talking from the moraine dam on the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the image where you can see a small village, perhaps. You can see my cursor, you'll be able to see the village here, around half of which was destroyed by the glough in the mid-80s. And so what we have are a drape of boulder and sort of large clasts and sediment which is deposited on the valley floor when the floodwaters recede, and these can have a legacy in the landscape which has been largely unexplored as well, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on. But you can see that they are capable of performing a lot of geomorphological work. We can have erosion, we can have deposition, we can also have erosion deposition occurring within a flood. And so what we end up with is a final deposit, and from that we have to do our best to try and reconstruct what actually happened when the flood occurred, and that's where numerical models are useful. In terms of the environmental impacts on landscapes and the physical world, then I've just come up with a few here. There are more. This is by no means an exhaustive list of impacts on landscapes, but I suppose the obvious, most visible one is the one in the bottom left, which is the valley floor fill and scour. We see these very prominent glough deposits which are left on the valley floor. We also have secondary hazards such as bank instability and so on. So after a glacial lake outburst flood has happened, then perhaps for some period of time after that, we still can expect some kind of instability, channel banks and so on. What's also worth mentioning is that glacial lakes are an important surface water store in high mountain and other environments, especially in dry season. They're very good at regulating flow, and whilst they don't contribute a huge amount, I suppose, they are nevertheless really quite important. And if we're thinking that, well, as we believe, it's well established, I think by this point that we'll see a reduction in meltwater as we move towards the end of the century, probably, then actually having some of these surface water stores retained in the landscape is really quite important as well. So although they present a hazard, there's potential for them to present an opportunity. Some colleagues at Leeds are doing some work looking at the potential of exploiting these surface water stores, such as glacial lakes, for hydropower, runoff, and so on. If a glacial outburst flood doesn't necessarily entirely drain the glacial lake, then we might also be set up for some future moraine dam instability. We do find, and there's some good examples from Peru in the Andes in particular, where we've had overtopping waves which have produced glacial outburst floods, but haven't actually formed a breach that's been large enough to fully drain a glacial lake itself. But we are left with then, in that situation, a moraine dammed lake, which might be prone to failure further down the line. And so that's something that's definitely worth keeping an eye on if we can. In terms of the societal impacts, again, this is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just some of my initial thoughts. But when we think about the potential impacts of a glacial lake outburst flood and who or what is affected, then we have obviously loss of life potential for injury as well, which affect individuals, family units and communities, damage to transport and energy infrastructure, which can affect transport of goods and services, and importantly, emergency access to sites immediately following glacial lake outburst flood. We can have disruption or outright destruction of hydropower facilities with implications for energy production, both domestic and international, where some of that power is exported overseas. Damage or destruction to land, agriculture, industry, residential and settlements, and amenity value land as well, which can cause risk to livelihoods and affect local economies directly or indirectly. We also have impacts for water quality, and we find short-term water quality degradation. What was one of the interesting outcomes from the recent Chamoli event in northern India, which wasn't a GLOF, although I know there were some reports of it being a GLOF early on in the days following the event, but it bared a lot of similarities, I suppose, to the glacial lake outburst flood, which may have been where some of the confusion arose from. But we found that we had water quality issues further downstream, which I believe were short-lived, but nevertheless were quite significant. There were impacts to water treatment plants and the capacity of that infrastructure to effectively process and clean the water in the river because of the sheer amount of sediment and turbidity of that water. And this can affect communities and infrastructure. What's interesting, I suppose, as well, something I found interesting from that Chamoli event is the question of what's going to happen in subsequent years. So you've had, in that case, a huge amount of sediment deposited in the valley bottom. And so when the monsoon river flows start to increase, you will presumably have reactivation of some of those sediments, which will have implications for potentially the hydropower downstream and also water quality. So we might see the situation perhaps in years to come where, until that source of sediment is exhausted or attains some kind of equilibrium or stability, you might actually have these annual pulses of sediment coming through these systems. And so that's an interesting thing to figure out. What I haven't really talked about yet at all is how climate change feeds into this picture. So we know how GLOFs develop, but actually what do we know about how many there have been in the past and how many there might be in the future? And one paper I'll touch on briefly is by Stefan Harrison and others from 5 years or so ago now. They looked at building a global picture of GLOFs from the late 1800s to present day, and I'm aware there are more up-to-date versions at a regional level of some of this work as well. But they found an increase in frequency of glacial lake outburst floods following 1930, which they believe is a lagged response to warming, which marked the end of the Little Ice Age. And this wasn't synchronous across the world. It was different according to the region because the climate history and the deglaciation response varies according to where you are in the world. But they found that climate change attribution was possible, but actually really quite complex. And so, although there was a reduction in frequency, I believe, an increase in GLOF frequency, we find that if we look on the right-hand side, this feeds in, I suppose, to an interesting model by John Clegg and Evans from quite some years ago now, where they looked at existing models of glacial lake expansion and failure frequency. And so there's an interesting question here about where we currently are, I suppose, on that trajectory on the bottom. We see that as temperatures cool, we don't have really any GLOFs because glaciers are expanding, and glacial lake outburst floods are generally a response to deglaciation. So when we have warming temperatures, we find, if you look at panel B there, the failure frequency of glacial lakes, at least conceptually, increases as well. So perhaps this is something that we're going to see as we move into this century, perhaps towards the end of the century, is that the increase that we might observe this peak, this increase in failure, as this kind of lag time between when deglaciation occurs and when a GLOF occurs is exhausted. We reach that lag, and it's going to be different for different catchments, different parts of the world. But it's going to be interesting to see and potentially have really quite significant implications for the communities, especially where we have expansion of populations and industry further and higher up in mountain catchments. I just very briefly put in a couple of examples here from Peru. There's two recent papers which you guys might find of interest. One published in Nature Geoscience, and a slightly older one from Christian Huggle, which looks at outburst flood hazard and climate change attribution in that part of the world. So yeah, please follow up on those if that's of interest. So we know where lakes are. If we move now on, this is the final part of my talk. I won't keep you too much longer. If we think about mitigation, how we can actually try and do something, or at least identify where the hazard is, so that we can inform some kind of response, then I suppose the first thing to do is to figure out where these glacial lakes are. And a recent paper from Dan Sugar and colleagues did the first job at mapping or spotting where these lakes were at a global scale, and looking also at how they've expanded through time. And we see large concentrations in many parts of the world, but significantly in the Himalaya, we have a lot of glacial lakes there, and they're getting larger. They tend to be smaller, I believe, was one of the outcomes from this paper. At the global scale, the lakes in the Himalaya aren't generally huge, but they are expanding very rapidly, which is of concern. And what we're ultimately interested in is something like this. This is borrowed from the IPCC report, 2014. And suppose when we're thinking about communities and how glacial outburst floods intersect with society, then what we want to try and establish is what the risk either to individuals or entire communities or infrastructure is. And so a few different things feed into that, one being hazard, the other being vulnerability, and the other being exposure. And what we have seen in recent years is a number of schemes to try and figure out what some of these things are. So in terms of GLOF hazard, what we found is that various first order schemes can be very useful to assess the glacial lake outburst flood posed by glacial lakes. The example on the right hand side is taken from one of Simon Allen's recent papers, which employed measures of topographic potential and other geometric descriptors, and to assign what's known as a hazard rank or a number to a given lake. And so most of this work can be done from using the DEM and knowledge of the location of the lakes themselves. And this information can be used to, in combination with knowledge of downstream vulnerability and exposure mapping, to identify priority lakes and even entire catchments for more targeted mitigation. Just because we have a glacial lake in a mountain range doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to produce a GLOF. And so there's more work that we need to do to unravel that and actually be more effective in any mitigation measures that we do put in place. This is one of the outcomes from Simon's work here, and they were looking along in Tibet for the most part, but on the left hand side we can see a series of dots where each dot is a lake, and the color of the dot relates to the hazard, which has been derived based on those topographic potential metrics and other indicators. And so where we have red, obviously it's very high lake hazard. And if you combine that with some knowledge about exposure, and they did some fairly simple outflow modeling from these lakes to figure out where people were downstream and how many might be affected and so on, and came up with this measure called lake danger, which was lake hazard multiplied by exposure. And so this kind of information is useful at an administrative level or state level or national level to start informing where to target resources. Some of the most extreme responses to try and reduce GLOF hazard come in the form of these large-scale engineering projects. This is an example from Charolpa in Nepal. This is the largest, if not the second largest, lake in the Nepal Himalaya. And around the turn of the century, there was a very large engineering project that was undertaken to basically form a concrete spillway and manage structure across the moraine dam outlet in order to provide some kind of control over the lake level. And they managed to lower the lake by a number of meters in the time following the construction of this spillway. And so initially it appears to be effective, but obviously it requires maintenance. It involves a huge amount of capital expense. I think this was something like 3 million or more US dollars to construct. And of course, these are very dynamic environments. And so if we consider that moraine dams may incorporate ice and are actually fairly dynamic structures, I suppose, then that's something that also needs to be considered. What is the long-term viability of things like this? They're going to require maintenance, and how feasible is it to roll these kinds of projects out across multiple lakes? A more prominent recent example, perhaps, is the work that the Nepalese army and the United Nations funded, in this case, to lower the hazard or reduce the hazard posed by image show in Nepal. Similar projects in many ways to the Charolpa work. It took 6 months, cost around about the same amount of money, I believe. And so, yeah, they're seemingly effective in the short term, but how feasible is it to roll these kind of solutions out more widely? I don't know the answer to that question. So if anyone is keen to discuss them, please feel free to do so. But I suppose the starting point for all this work is identifying which lakes are deemed to pose a hazard, not just now, but also in the future as well. So there's a lot of question marks about how triggers might change. We have a reasonable handle on where we think lakes will develop in the future by using estimates of ice thickness and removing that ice from the landscape to see where over deepenings are and where lakes might form and so on. And so we actually have a reasonably well-developed idea about that side of things, but it's obviously something that needs to be repeated at a semi-regular interval to update it with this recent knowledge. We also see that there's a very high risk to hydropower. And as Wolfgang said in his talk several weeks ago, and we spent some time talking about this, I believe, but we're seeing that hydropower is expanding we're finding more hydropower projects are being developed at higher altitudes. And so the closer you move these things towards the source of an outburst flood event, be it a GLOF or otherwise, then the larger the hazard and the larger the exposure is going to be to these structures. And as we saw in the recent Chamoli event, it can have really quite devastating impacts to hydropower when a large mass flow comes down the valley. This is a screen grab that I borrowed from one of Wolfgang's papers, which shows this quite well at a regional scale, where planned or under construction or even operational hydropower intersects the paths of potential GLOFs, and it's quite striking, some of the outcomes from that work. This again is the last time I'll touch on this Chamoli event, but this was interesting in many ways because we did some work following the event which I might add destroyed or damaged at least 3 or 4 hydropower facilities. We used a landscape evolution model combined with a hydrodynamic model to look at what the evolution of the landscape would be over following the event. And so we've had the floods come through, the valley floor in this case has been filled up with a lot of sediment. And we found that actually these sediments erode and degrade really quite quickly. We find a lot of rapid elevation change happening with implications for outputs to sediment yield and so on. It's something that I've not seen really considered a huge amount in the literature, but I think it's probably going to be quite important if we do see an increase in GLOF frequency. Then we will have more mountain catchments choked with sediment and trying to adjust and find some kind of new equilibrium. And so the amount of sediment throughput on an annual time frame and on a seasonal time frame is something that would be interesting to look at and try and quantify and communicate to people who could benefit from that information locally. So final slide, I think, or penultimate slide now. What I thought about is talking a little bit about community engagement and how we would actually, in practice, how do you come up with some kind of early warning system? So we know where the lakes are, we know what we know what the impacts of a GLOF could be. And so one of the important things, the most important thing arguably to do, is to come up with some kind of system or methods for communicating, either, if not in real time, then certainly in advance, of a GLOF happening, what the hazard might be, and so on. And there's lots of technology that can be useful for helping us to do this. I put some examples on the left-hand side here of tech that we have access to, which can be integrated to develop early warning systems. Some countries, I know Nepal had some early warning systems set up. I believe there's some in India, although feel free to correct me if I'm wrong there. And certainly in South America, we have early warning systems set up as well. And they are expensive and they require maintenance, but they can be effective, I suppose. And these tools might range from things like buoy-mounted DGPSs in lakes to track lake level and see how that might change rapidly. So if lake level drops, we can send signals from a DGPS system in the lake to trigger an alert. Similarly, we can have DGPSs placed on moraines. These have long-term implications as well and can be useful for looking at moraine degradation alongside DEM differencing. These can be supplemented again by webcams. We're also seeing that there's improved cellular data coverage, especially in high mountain areas. And so that was previously a barrier, and in many cases, I imagine still is a barrier to uptake of these kind of technologies, but it seems to be improving. And so the data feed from high mountain areas, the sources of these potential GLOFs down to communities is probably going to get better as time progresses. Other things include flow stage pressure sensors to look at sudden rise in river levels and trigger alerts using that kind of information, and also seismic or signal detections or geophones. And I suppose really, as has been shown in Peru, an example on the right-hand side there, what really we would work towards is a combination of different methods based on which method is most appropriate for capturing potential triggers. And that really needs to be informed by, I suppose, a combination of remote and field-based investigations and consultation with local stakeholders and experts. And what's also really, or perhaps the most important thing here, is engaging with communities. I'm aware there can be skepticism about building and developing these systems in these catchments, and so getting communities involved so they understand what the hazard is and how this technology can actually help to hopefully keep them safe is really quite important. So final slide, thanks for bearing with me. I thought I'd finish on with some things that we know and some things that we don't know about glacial lake outburst floods. So hopefully, as you've gathered from the last sort of 45 minutes or so, we know where current lakes are for the most part, but we have some kind of handle on where they might develop in the future. We also know that we can employ, if we wish, a range of models to simulate glacial lake outburst flood process chains and look at where those process chains intersect people and things. And we know for the most part where those vulnerable populations are, or we have methods to identify these. But some things we perhaps don't yet know, in no particular order, I might add, is how the magnitude and the frequency of GLOF triggers might evolve in coming decades. So great, we know where the lakes are, but actually probably one of the largest question marks in the field And this is a theme that I'm seeing in lots of papers coming through, is that the big question mark is how these triggers are going to evolve in the future. Might we find that understudied conditioning factors and triggers gain more prominence? So things like degradation of moraine dams and piping style failures. Has that been overlooked? I don't know, but it perhaps warrants a little bit more investigation. What is the geomorphological legacy of these extreme flows? So an event happens, it causes damage, it can be devastating, it can cause loss of life, and so on. But what's the longer term impact, I suppose, in the landscape of these flows? Something that's interesting to me, and hopefully I think would be worthwhile to explore, and I'm keen to do so, and I encourage others to do so as well, clearly. And how might exposed populations and infrastructure change in the future? We know that the populations are obviously continuing to expand, and generally speaking, expanding to higher up in these catchments, but we don't really know at what pace that's going to happen. And I think really it's a case of keeping an eye and regularly updating hazard maps, regularly updating exposure maps, and so on, so that we don't just produce these lake inventories and hazard inventories and then we just don't touch them again for 20 years or so. I think there needs to be some systems in place so that these things are revisited at some kind of defined interval, so that they can be updated accordingly. That's me. I'll be quiet now, and thank you for your attention.